Thank you, Jacob. So we hope everyone can hear us, and we hope people are out there. But yeah, this is our second open rooms, as Jacob said. So please be gentle with us. But my role today is to help facilitate questions from the general public about this new exciting project, and just to find out more generally about Hafsah and Sarah and your own practice. So I was wondering whether I could hand it over to you guys, maybe Hafsah, if you'd like to go first, just to hear a little bit more about you in general.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you, Liz. Great to be here. And so I've been working in socially engaged practice for a number of years. And I've kind of worked in lots of different contexts, from sort of educational context to health to community to a very public square type of context as well. And yeah, I've thoroughly, developed in this way of engaging with people in the making of art, but also within that sort of having, very importantly, some sense of exchange between myself as an artist and the participants and collaborators that I work with. So I work very interdisciplinary, film, photography, writing, installation, performance, kind of all areas that I like to sort of work in as an artist. So yeah, based in Manchester and loving it.
And did you have some examples of work you wanted to share?
So,
we can say it later, it's up to you, entirely up to you.
Yeah. Does Sarah want to go, or shall I just whack into some work?
Yeah, share your work, yeah.
Okay, so let me just quickly share my screen here with you. So what I'm showing you now are some examples of some work, some commissioned work that I've done over the years. So this, firstly, is a image taken from a commission that happened quite a few years ago now. It was with Newcastle Mental Health Trust, commissioned by, and I worked with medical art and architecture projects. They were partners in the project, and basically I had a residency program in a mental health facility with medium secure residents, and it was a 6-week workshop program that I sort of facilitated. Excuse me, working both with staff and residents, and so throughout the working, it became apparent that a lot of restrictions, around identifiability became an issue. Didn't start off as one, but became one during the program. So I was left with a way of having to work on a portraiture project with residents, and this is what we came up with, sort of just looking at fabrics that hold our bodies and the kind of clothes that we all like to share as part of ourselves in a way. So this became very important to a lot of the residents, and these are the residents' own clothes that we used in the making of this. So another aspect of the project was, like I said, sort of fabric, and I was very interested in how I can use that as a way of making more work. And I became very interested in just the kind of connections and the kind of really depth that you can go to when you're using cameras into something like fabric, and you can just isolate them and take something from them. And this was another exploration that I developed while on the medium secure unit with the residents. Again, these images are actually permanently installed in the facility at St Nicholas Hospital. So they're quite large. They're like 2 meters by 1 and a bit. So a lot of health and safety issues around their production installation resulted as well, which was something different for me. So that's some of that work at Newcastle. Moving on to some of my other socially engaged work. This is out in a displacement camp in South Lebanon. It was an Arts Council research project that I wanted to do out there. And, you know, the displacement camp is really interesting because you've got lots of people from lots of different backgrounds, classes, different countries kind of come in. And the kind of community that emerges in that space is really quite interesting. So I was always very interested in that, and I managed to make some contacts with a Palestinian Lebanese family, and it was literally, they had 4 rooms, 4 living spaces with all the wash areas, and I think about 60 something members of the same family were living in that complex. And I found that quite interesting to work with that family and make some of these photographs with the young people in the family. So this was quite interesting. And the reason why they're all kind of in, this is just one image, it's one work with the 4 images on there. I thought that was quite reflective of the way in which in a displacement camp you're having to share the same space. So I wanted, you know, these faces, these people, these wonderful sort of beings to share the same frame, if you like. So that became quite interesting. I was very interested in doing more of that work. So potentially I could revisit it. Moving on, this is a series now that was commissioned by Gloucester City Council, I think. A project just to kind of build some connections within the city through working with some youth groups. And a lot of the portraits here were, it was interesting because, you know, there was a lot of social tension between groups. The city, according to some, was at risk of being, divided to such an extent that these connections were, becoming impossible to make between people. And it was interesting how, of course, photography was a medium through which, I could definitely look at some ideas about how to bridge those divisions using photography. And so I used a kind of sepia colored film for this work. It's really important because I just wanted, color was an option, black and white obviously is as well, but sepia tended to represent something that was a bit more middle of the road, I guess. And I just love that quality anyway. So that was quite interesting because it allowed us to talk about these images, which became a very important part of the project. I really like the idea of having photographs, images that, have some sort of narration or narrative around them. Mm-hmm. How artists do that is really creative and really quite inspiring. But I've always been interested in those kind of stories. And let me show you something else that kind of relates to this idea of separated together, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is an installation work. This was a very big project in the sense that I set myself a lot of work with this one. And it literally was a kind of a social engagement project, collaborative project with members of the public. I put out a call and got people to kind of respond. And I selected 3 people and I took them on a journey of filmmaking through 3 processes: idea, production, editing. In the end, I used all of those videos, recording each process, I should say. And the final installation was a gallery full of monitors which showcased each stage of the filmmaking process. In addition, it also showcased the completed films, which were, they're all turning like that, which were, the installation itself was devised, separated into different areas and enclosures. And I don't know why all of my pictures have turned into the same one right there. I have no idea.
Because it's a live digital event, so it has to do this to you. That's part of the process, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think you're right, Liz, because you saw that happen right in front of our very online eyes, right?
It likes to do it to you online and live, of course.
Right. So I did have some stuff to. Well, let me just see if I can salvage any of this.
No, it's fine. I think already I'm trying to resist from asking questions, but already you've kind of brought some things up that I think that other people have kind of asked about as well. So I think around these ideas of barriers or restrictions to engaging with different groups, and some other things around you talked about one of the projects about exhibiting within that space as well. So again, I think the context of when you exhibit and how you exhibit in certain situations, I think, will also come up within the questions as well. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, sure.
Questions as well. Thank you, Hafsah.
No worries, cool.
I'm Sarah. I work for NOVUS, as was explained at the beginning. My role within the organisation is bringing alternative education provision to prison establishments. My background is art. I've got a creative background which stems back from very early days myself, then studying textiles, embroidery, working in kind of textile industry, but very interested about adapting approaches. So always kind of working with mixed media and kind of just exploring, really. That's kind of an interest of kind of being presented barriers and responding to them. In the context of what I work now, there certainly is various things that present difficulties in bringing creative offers to within the prison establishments, which I particularly love responding to. I like taking in an alternative offer, and I particularly enjoy working within the education strand and using creative platforms as an engagement tool and a tool for kind of rehabilitation and developing people's confidence and kind of skill sets and knowledge and experiences. And that's something that I particularly think that this project that we're going to be talking about a little bit further down will certainly kind of enable us to explore. I've got a couple of pictures myself to show some of the things that I've worked on with various colleagues within the organisation. So
great. We'll do round 2 of the screen share.
What I've got here is just an example of a project that was kind of, from my perspective, was plotted out and planned in the sense of, I suppose, loosely what the outcomes could be, and from that perspective creating a brief that enabled colleagues within the education department to respond to. So what I've got here is an example of an installation within one of the prison sites based on Roy Lichtenstein. And why I'm particularly sharing this is because it's a cross-curriculum approach. So the project itself involved all curriculum areas, from maths, English, to people in the construction areas making the frameworks, right down to the creative team, the art department, the tutor and the learners themselves. But the actual concept and the realisation of this was very much driven by the residents, by the participants who wanted this to be their outcome and response. And I think it just kind of shows how education, creativity are kind of being aligned, and how creative platforms can create a catalyst for kind of wider scope for other areas to kind of come into. So this is just one example. I need to get off this, stop sharing, share another one. Well, that's the same one. I don't want that one.
It's after us today.
Yeah.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
That's why I had a disclaimer. I was like, it's our second live event. Everyone has to be gentle and kind.
And again, this is another project that just shows how the work that I kind of orchestrate and kind of really kind of champion across the prison estate. This is an outcome that was within the Tate Exchange in Liverpool in 2019. But what this kind of illustrates is a project that was undertaken across 5 prison sites working on the same brief, and also included families of the residents of the site. So it's very much a collective of family engagement, education, creativity, and the outcome with it being in the Tate as an external platform is to enable that conversation about rehabilitation, and to kind of showcase that these offers are kind of crucial in supporting alternative kind of opportunities, but also can be really valuable in supporting family relationships as well. So here it shows some kind of textile outcomes, some kind of paper banners, some film. So it's a collection of different media, and again, the actual outcomes themselves, like the paper strips, that was the learners responding to the techniques that they were kind of being shared with them, and collectively as groups had the overarching understanding of the communal outcome of the Tate, but they weren't directed to produce these specific outcomes. I think that the pieces themselves are very much individualised from the participants of each of the sites. And again, the fabric pieces are very kind of individual to the family groups, and the kind of imagery and some of the kind of marks on there are representations of different kind of, I suppose, memories or landmarks or things that are prompt conversations. So for me, it just illustrates some of the kind of the platforms of what it supports within the criminal justice setting.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Again, I'm quickly noting things down because I know they attach to some of the questions that some people have already sent in, but it might be nice to start with one, just following on about that idea of how you build up a sense of a relationship, like a working dynamic with the people that you're going to collaborate with. And in our case, that will be the learners within the HMP setting, but also their family members as well. I guess one of the questions that came from one of our staff members at OpenEye actually was, how do you build trust and a sense of community, I guess, when you're working with people within the kind of prison setting? And I guess I'd extend that to their family members as well.
So from my experience, it's that kind of open and honest and transparent conversation. So if I have an idea or a concept, I work through my experience of being and working in that setting for 14 years. So I've kind of my understanding of the operational kind of fundamentals of a prison setting, looking about what would be new kind of approaches, but very much then having conversations with wider stakeholders within the prison and colleagues before taking that offer to the participants who are going to collaborate. Because for me, if there's going to be complete barriers to something, that's going to inhibit how people can respond to that. So I think that if everybody's clear on the aims and the kind of direction, then I think for me that's where the participants can really shape the offer to be meaningful to themselves, and then completely take that I suppose the idea and opportunity and really drive it. And from me, it's that's what builds the community within the groups, and also extends to the families through the conversations throughout the making. And also the majority of the work that I'm involved in does have an external platform, whether it be out in the community or whether external in the sense of sharing it with family members. For me, that sharing is key to kind of supporting some other strands, but also having that conversation about why are we doing an alternative offer, what's the kind of values really.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, obviously with Hafsah yourself, the project we're doing together hasn't started yet. So we're, in terms of kind of throwing that question to you, I guess it's maybe more in terms of a broader sense of how you go about building a trust and a sense of community, maybe within another project that you've worked on previously.
Yeah, I mean, you know, working in hospitals and working in displacement camps, you do have the learner, the participant that you invest in, you engage with. And of course, building trust takes time. You know, it's a repetitive, consecutive kind of thing that can happen, that people know that you're coming in every. I mean, I used to go into one school where I used to work, and it wasn't I used to go in every Thursday, and it wasn't a Thursday anymore, it was a Hafsah day. It was almost like it became something else, because that that sort of knowing that this is going to happen continuously for a lot of people means a lot of things. You know, I think we can take things for granted, but I think in certain contexts, just being present punctually and on time, available at the same time, doing the same thing, I think that builds a lot. I think that goes a really long way. And also working with families, what I find, you know, you, like I say, you can be working with a participant, a collaborator, an individual, and you can do some great, fantastic work, and you think, but then the dynamics change as soon as the family kind of come in. The person somehow gets this incredible context that you weren't able to experience before, and suddenly it's like this person is like a jigsaw, a piece in their own jigsaw. And you know, and for me as an artist, working with people and family, individuals and families in this way, you know, I really appreciate that kind of, that sense that everybody's part of a bigger network, a bigger story, a bigger community, if you like. And yeah, I think social engaged work allows you to bring that to the fore, and that sense of community then, for me, gets embedded into projects. As soon as you start to see people, you know, as being part of something, then yeah, I think that sense of community does tend to thrive really importantly, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think as well, and that's a kind of social engagement that you have with people over a period of time, particularly now, more broadly, we're really rethinking what that means, aren't we, in our current situation. And I had a question around that, actually, that, you know, again, like, we're all thinking about this idea of maybe social and creative restrictions that are happening in a much broader sense at the moment. But this will have a very particular context when we're talking about kind of work within the prison setting. And one of the questions was around, have you started to think about approaches you might take around ideas of restrictions, which in this context is things like restrictions to online and digital tools, which the rest of us actually are now kind of grasping onto as a tool right now. So I guess it's just thinking about ideas around that, and it ties into another question from a photographer, Daniel Reagan, who again was just asking around, you know, what sort of restrictions are there, I guess, in a practical sense, around equipment that you might bring into units. So again, these kind of potentials, but these restrictions, and what's your approach around those?
I think in the sense of what I mean, as you said earlier, we haven't kind of taken this forward with the participants yet, but what we have done is look at, I suppose, the parameters of some of these limitations, and we've had some quite interesting conversations around alternative approach. And I think, for me, doing something different is brilliant, and I think I think if we can kind of plan something that considers some of the possible limitations and respond and give alternative approaches, then you can achieve. But I think it's recognizing what some of the restrictions are and responding to them and using that as a benefit. I mean, many of the participants I've worked with over the years are very kind of creative in the sense of materials that they might use because they haven't got access to other things. So I think, again, using the participants as the expert and kind of engaging them in how do they want to shape it. And what I tend to do in many of the projects is kind of, I suppose, setting the stall out in the sense of, as I said earlier, about setting the aims and objectives of what we'd like to achieve, but then putting in some of the practical fundamental considerations, like some of the tools we might not have, how might we respond with them barriers. And I think, again, that's where you start it supports the trust building, it supports that project being led by the participants themselves and having something that they're shaping rather than having something that's being done to them and their kind of shaping the experience. In terms of the wider limitations around the question that the photographer asked, I think it's that that conversation with the prison site about what are the expectations, I suppose factoring in that the setting and the context where you are, and that there is going to be kind of ethical considerations as well as kind of security considerations, that regardless of alternative ways, there's still going to be a reason why something might not be able to happen. And I think really understanding the environment and knowing that as much as you might try and present things, that the answer might be no because of the bigger fundamentals of the context. But yeah, it's that conversation really. Again, it for me is the key part of the projects.
And again, Hafsah, you know, even when you came to meet with us about the project, these were things that probably were already kind of going on your mind about the practicalities. So I don't know if you want to add in.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I saw it like it's a great opportunity to be creative, to as an artist, as a practitioner, to find different ways of engagement right now. I think that's probably very important for socially engaged practice. And the fact that the moment of obviously the context that we're living in at the moment, you know, people are going back to a lot of socialist values of sharing and the communal and community. It's all come to the fore. And I think this is just something that's going to power socially engaged practice. It should, because there's a lot of links there. And so, but having said that, when you work in this way, there are lots of barriers that have to be overcome, often on the spot, in the room, you know, with everyone sort of like thinking, okay, now what? And so I think, you know, from my experience, when you as a practitioner artist going in, when you're creative, you kind of engender it as well. So, you know, creativity is not the, you know, the stay of the artist or the creative professional coming in.
Mm-hmm.
An important part of the sort of work within education that I've done is to sort of really get people to understand their own creativity and to mobilize that for things that are, you know, not just fulfilling learning objectives as such, but just being a much more meaningful way in which you can engage with the world around you and express yourself to create some really powerful meaning, you know. So again, I've just come back from Nepal. I was out there for about a couple of months ago. I was out there for about a month, and it was a filmmaking project, and we had no equipment for half of the project, you know, and I literally travelled across sort of central western regions of the country with the British Council, thankfully. So we had good drivers. So we kind of got to these places, but the equipment, the kit was not there. It was like 70% of it was missing. So it meant you had to then think about imagery in a completely different way, and through drama, art, practical activities, performances, we were able to do a lot of work that kind of, you know, went far in sort of engaging with the visual storytelling world with empathy. And I think that's the crucial thing. And when we were at the initial stages of this, I was thinking about all those experiences that I had and thinking about how wonderful that I can sort of bring them into play now, because it's really important that those things come into play. And I think one of the things we discussed very, you know, I think both Liz and I, we both had some ideas about some sort of postal engagement, sort of using ways in which we can use, you know, go back to basics in a way and think about how we can, you know, how I can mobilize some of those processes for the benefit of the project. And so quite happy and excited, not happy and excited about the barriers as such, but happy about the solutions that we're all kind of coming up with, to enable us to do what we want to do, with the residents. Absolutely.
And I think totally that idea of seeing these barriers as actually creative problem solving for us. You know, if that's what our bread and butter is, then like you say, it's not that you're overtly happy about the barrier, but you can accept and kind of flourish in that challenge maybe.
Yeah,
and like you mentioned, Sarah, it's about actually what's been really nice for you is to see how in previous projects those barriers have actually enabled the learners to sort of take it in their own direction, because they can be the most flexible in terms of working around it. So I mean, it's all kind of really useful food for thought for when we start the project. Another question that one of our volunteers, Leah, had asked Maybe this is actually a question for me and Sarah, I guess, as project planners, but I'm going to let Sarah answer. How was access gained to confirm a photography project like this could happen and be delivered within a prison? Because it's a really good question. How do you even go about that sort of process, I guess?
So I think from our kind of initial relationship, it was kind of looking at how we could align the photography and the kind of work and in the environment that I'm operating in and kind of working with the various groups. I think what we kind of collectively did then was kind of look at some possibilities that might be enable something to be realised. And again, it goes back to that point of having that conversation. There is kind of nothing can happen without that wider prison support. It's not something that can be done by one single person. So for me, it was kind of having that conversation with colleagues within NOVUS, but then also wider within the prison estate, looking at who would be interested in embracing the opportunity. But actually, what was the purpose of the opportunity? What would it bring to take such an offer to the curriculum? How would that enhance the experience for the learners in the education context? But then obviously looking broadly what that might be collectively for you and I. We'll look through that family engagement and the external access to the gallery and kind of how we can use photography as a communication tool, and all them things for me were kind of integral to getting that buy-in. I think, as I said earlier, once we had an aligned approach, something that I suppose was a little bit more solid rather than just a loose idea, I think people are then more receptive to kind of take you seriously in what your offer can and how it can be realised. I think also some of the experience of working on other projects and having to operationally navigate certain things is also beneficial, because if people have seen that something's being realised before, again, it's that trust. It's kind of them small steps that build the relationship. And I think that's something that's really integral to taking something new in. You need somebody to trust your kind of thoughts and intentions. And I think without that, it'd be very difficult to kind of just drop something into any site, really.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that these initial conversations, I guess, before, I mean, they've actually been going on for about 2 years. So even planning around social driven projects it takes that time before you can start it. But it kind of picking up a little bit on what you said, Sarah, about I guess how you were pitching it as this enhanced or new offer and focusing on photography specifically. I've got a question here from Jacob that says, in what capacity do you think this project and others like it have to enrich communication between prisoners and their families, but specifically in terms of, I guess, the use of introducing photography as the medium? Yeah. Kind of what does that bring to the table?
I think when we've had the conversations about what some of the community projects that yourself and kind of wider the Open Eye have kind of been part of, I think that was something really interesting to myself and also Andy, colleague within the organisation, about how this new offer could enable that kind of a new platform for both family members and the residents to kind of engage. So for me, it would be something that, I mean, technology is kind of readily available kind of on the outside, in the sense of people taking photographs with the phones and so on, but then looking at what are people capturing, so it's kind of capturing memories and conversation points and so on. So I think in this instance of the project and using photography as a vehicle, it's something new and different, but also it's something that the participants are learning, both the family members and the residents. It's kind of that shared learning. So for me, to enhance the family perspective of it through the photography, it's kind of being able to have conversations, sharing technically gained skills, if you will, about what they're doing, but then the outcomes as well. What are they collaborating on as kind of family members for their outcomes? What's photography enabling them to share, either together or wider to any audience we kind of decided or collectively decided we would take this. What it's kind of empowering as well. It's being able to kind of, it's another platform to I suppose, tell stories and to kind of have that narrative. And I think the platform of what we're looking at of the family members and the participant is that narrative between the family members, but then also that narrative with the community. Whether that community is a closed community in the sense of selective audience, or whether it's a conversation or with a wider audience in a larger public platform, that would be determined by the cohort participating, because that'd be part of what they're wanting to shape.
We spoke about that quite a bit in terms of the actual outputs, like the visual outputs. We don't know in what way they will be shared yet, because it will be completely driven by the people who take part. And you know, that might be that they share it just amongst themselves as learners and family members, or it might be could be totally public. I guess, is there anything you wanted to add, Hafsah, about that question around, I guess, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit before when you were talking about your projects, about this idea of the photography and video medium that you use, kind of enabling these ideas of telling stories, and specifically about the benefits of those mediums for that.
Yeah, I think that idea of storytelling is obviously at the heart of what photography can do in a prison context. And also, it's not just about looking at images, it's being able to, it's not just about taking images, right, or visualizing them or whatever. It's also looking at them and responding to them in hopefully powerful ways, because photography has that ability to, all visual forms, all cultural forms have that ability to reach into people so that they have these powerful responses. And I suppose we're not really going to teach people how to respond, we're going to draw those responses out. I think that's what I'm interested in how I can sort of draw out these responses, and in doing so, hopefully the participants will feel like, oh, okay, I've got something to give in this, because it's already there, and the other thing about that I just want to quickly add, Liz, is the fact that, with photography and the residents and their families, it's almost like maybe new meanings can emerge from within that family setting, purely because they're looking at a photograph in a different way of somebody who's very familiar to them, but a photograph of that person has a different feeling. They get different things from it. And I just very quickly, I remember working at this school once, and I did these recordings with these pupils as part of sort of monologue making, and we had a share in the school, and we invited the local community, and parents came. And what was really interesting was when parents saw their child on a screen talking freely, they really couldn't recognize this character. Thought, I can't believe he or she is doing or saying this. And I was really intrigued as an artist about that. I was really intrigued about what is it when you know someone, but then when they appear on screen or as an image, there's something different about what they represent, what they are, what they can become. And I think that has some really powerful, that could be really powerful within our project. I'm very interested to see how residents choose to represent things in themselves or their world, and then how those representations change, change who they are in the sight of their family and other community sort of members. I'm really interested. I think photography has got a very powerful mechanism through which it allows those different responses and representations to actually sit with people, and people are okay with it. I think, and I'm sure the same will be the case here, so we'll see.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you mentioned around this idea of how people can create images that is a representation in themselves, but not necessarily of themselves, because obviously within our context, but more broadly, I see it in projects all the time, is that you may not want to be in the image, or there's certain elements of anonymity where you, for practical or ethical reasons, safeguarding reasons, you simply can't. And it's one of the questions that's come through. Well, it's two questions from the Discord. So this is why I look down every now and again. I'm not being strange. all the tech. So a question from Dec and a question from Alice on Discord around, firstly, ethical considerations that relate specifically to socially engaged in practice in prisons that you're considering. And within that, with Dec, he talks about how you then approach this idea of anonymity with a participant, which I guess is part of these ethical considerations that we have. He also does ask, actually, do you think there's anything gained or lost by taking away someone's face or name in work that you might make in that context, which is quite an interesting one. So sorry, I feel like I've just thrown 3 questions at you at once.
Yeah.
Do you want me to?
On Sarah, yeah.
So I think in terms of ethical considerations, completely within the context of the criminal justice setting, obviously that for me just seems like an obvious one, in the sense of we're protecting both the residents of the establishments, but then also in most instances some victim or wider family members. So it's having a consideration around the people we're working with and the context. And I think part of that is around kind of identity. In terms of kind of keeping people kind of anonymous, I think that I've seen many examples of how people can kind of tell their stories or represent themselves in a way that's kind of not in a portrait style, or not kind of explicitly what we might perceive as kind of exposing somebody in the sense of a portrait or similar. And I think there's something for me about quite creative around if that is a restriction, then how do we work around representing or telling stories with that kind of consideration and kind of thing in place? Because if we want to create a response, how do we overcome that potential barrier? I think that there's a place for that as well, for that people can consider how they want to be represented. In terms of that last part of the question about removing somebody's name or somebody's kind of visual identity, again, I think that that's part of it is a nature of the environment that we're working in, and recognizing that there are some kind of points in place that we kind of have to accept, as I said earlier. And part of that is that we're working with the kind of structures and policies that are in place to protect. And I think one of them is considering around those 2 specific things. So I personally kind of accept that, but then don't see it as we can't do that. It's how we can overcome and kind of still showing another way.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think, the first image that I've started my showcase with is an example of how security in that medium secure unit, it was no longer possible to photograph residents, a portrait, you just couldn't do it, and those were the rules, and that was it. And so what was left of the project then, how were we to create work that was still meaningful, that still engaged residents, that still looked at identity in their sort of setting? And so using the clothes just became a response to that. See, for me, that image is so much about the people that I work with, but of course for the audience, all of that is removed. What you're left with is a set of clothes that I've managed to kind of, the hood actually just stood on its own, strangely, but anyway, it all kind of there was no manipulation in that image whatsoever, I promise. And it was just like standing, and it just assumed this position on the chair as we had it. So I think it worked for us there, because I think that was quite powerful. I think it was powerful for the residents, because they never thought that they could actually do something like this. So when we started to play around with the clothes and look at how we can actually, it became much more meaningful than perhaps taking photographs of faces. So I think it does, like the questioner said, Dec, I think he said, that what do you lose and what do you gain? Yes, you lose, but the gains, you can never be aware of what they are until they're actually there for you to extrapolate.
I think seeing that piece that you showed and you're kind of referring to, for me, there's an element of intrigue there. What's this kind of story behind that? So as a viewer who's not familiar with the context of the work, I think there's still kind of an interest and an intrigue around how that's representing and what's kind of the stories behind. And I think that that's obviously that there will be, as you've been integral to that project, you kind of hold some of that conversation. But I think for me as a viewer, I think that there's still something it doesn't have to explicitly kind of represent. It can be an individual, it can be a collective response as that is to kind of illustrate points.
Absolutely. I mean, just the things that a person owns and has, you know, those objects often will say more about those people than perhaps, you know, certainly from a photography point of view. I remember I did a documentary and I took it around the country, actually, to lots of different places. We had lots of panel discussions. It was about Syrian families arriving into Manchester, but I hadn't been told, but none of the participants, I could show them for legal reasons. I thought, oh great, here I am again in a situation where, you know, so it ended up being, you know, just focused on hands. And so, yeah, who'd have thought that some people in the audience said, actually, you know, the fact that we couldn't see these people and we were just sort of looking at their hands often, or, you know, someone's shoulder shot or something, it just built this sense of, like you say, Sarah, it built this kind of sense of intrigue. Like, you know, people could visualize, or people could, you know, you no longer needed a visual face to, if you like, make credible the stories that they were telling. It was the stories that were important, not necessarily the kind of veneer of a facial portrait, if you like. So yeah, so I think that will, yeah, there's lots to explore there, I think, within the setting that we're, you know, the project. So
one of the questions from Soha maybe can just extend on that a little bit around, obviously we've talked about the fact that part of the project is around that ability to work collaboratively with other people to help tell their stories and relate to their identity in a way that makes sense for them. But she was asking for you, what's the most interesting part of that process of working in that way?
So the most interesting part of kind of like
that collaborative process, I guess, particularly when
the
story is not your own. The story is somebody else. So you do take on that kind of facilitator role in that regard. But
yeah. I mean it's probably the reason why I work in this way, because people are fantastic, complex beings, and it's a real privilege often to be able to be in a place and time to work creatively with people on things. And I don't know, that process is really magical. You know, there's something really quite I think you've got to have, I think there's a sort of social intelligence, if you like, that kind of comes into play. I mean, of course, empathy, you know, of course, kind of, you know, this, you know, your body language, your kind of transparency, all of these things matter, and they help to populate that space between you and the participant with loads of seeds, if you like, and stuff just grows invisibly while you're doing and thinking and making, perhaps even. So yeah, I don't know, my story, participant stories, often there's always a connection, because because there are two people in a room who are working together, or a bunch of people in a room working together, you know, you kind of realize, oh, there are those connections to be made. So I don't know how to answer that one, other than just, I mean, I can't show you, but I'm absolutely filled inside, like, with warmth with that question, because it's all about that engagement and the kind of way in which I've not really thought about it too much, because there is something sort of surreal and can't really place into words, actually, that goes on. You just kind of connect with people. I think art, I think this is the thing, if you were going to stop at a bus stop with someone, you could have a fantastic conversation, you could have a really random, brilliant, crazy kind of conversation, fine, but the kind of connection that art allows you to have with people, and these are people often you don't know. These are people who you're beginning to know. You're in a place and a time. You're in a kind of construct, a kind of frame, a context, and I guess it's just having that reach for people that you're allowed to explore a little bit. So yeah, it's fantastic.
So I guess the social relationships that you're developing in a way are the practice. They are part and parcel of the practice, and it's the visual tools that are going to kind of almost document or demonstrate what that social journey was, which I think is true of all socially engaged approaches to practice generally. But yeah, it's nice to see. It's nice to be, like you said, it's nice to be asked the question.
Yeah, like, absolutely. And to make visible, really importantly, I think, to make visible the fact that this is the process, these are the tools, these are the resources. So, and to allow those things to be credible in their own right, I think is really important for socially engaged practice, particularly when you're dealing with, you know, art objects that you want them to have a wider critical audience. And you want them to speak to themes that are that are contemporary, if they should want to, but you don't want any restrictions on that. You want the playing ground to be really open and free for socially engaged practice. And I think making the process more visible in that helps. Helps people to understand really what is going on, because people in socially engaged practice know it really well, but I think people outside looking in, I think sometimes I don't know, I'm not too sure myself how much of that process can be shown or is shown. So I've always got that question in my mind when I go into a project, so we'll see.
So it'll be a question back on us as organisational partners for you now. Like, how do we help share that process for you? Right, you'll be on my to-do list. How do we do this? How do we help?
Yes.
I guess we've not actually got that long left. No. We have been whispering on. There's a couple of ones that have come through. This one's actually just in terms of inspiration by other practitioners or other projects, just to either of you. I guess if you've been doing research or you've been working in this field for a while, are there any other contemporary photography or broader art projects which have involved working within the criminal justice setting and or with their family members that you've been kind of looking towards for your own inspiration or been inspired by, that you might want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot. I have a lot of time to be doing a lot of things. So Anthony Wewiора's assisted portraits were, as a project, I think is quite interesting. You know, the idea of, it's just so what Anthony did was he placed like a remote, so participants in front of the camera could take the photograph themselves by pressing this button for the shutter. So you got these portraits that were very kind of sort of controlled by the participant. I really liked that idea, so that was quite interesting. I came across another project where a photographer, I think it was in America, went to spoke to inmates and asked them what they would like a photograph of, and then spent the next sort of 3 months going to places and finding things to photograph to give to prisoners, which was interesting. I thought I really liked the idea of the photograph as a object of exchange between people. This was something that you gave as a gift, something that very important, because that kind of, when that kind of really pulls out our sort of family albums, things that we like to gift to each other. Photography is often used for that purpose. What else? I've come across a few things. I quite like Joy Gregory's work, Sights of Africa, where she goes across London and she finds these buildings which were sort of either housed slaves or were party to that enslavement industry, and she uses text to kind of juxtapose onto the image, so that you get this sort of nice absence presence thing going on. I really like the idea of text in photographs, and I was just quite inspired that might give residents or family members some other ways in which to get in or get out of the photograph in a way. I could go on. I won't.
I'll maybe ask Sarah, just so because I'm get warned to round up shortly, I'm sure. So.
I think since kind of engaging in this project brief, I've been looking at kind of what work has occurred through photography within the prison estate. So looking at kind of the Kersler outcomes for the category of photography, and looking at how people have, I suppose, navigated some of the restrictions we've spoken about, and what kind of imagery and outcomes people have been able to capture. Because for me, I'm quite interested in how. So if something's been captured, how people represent themselves, but in some instances, how they capture the environment. And I suppose for me, that's then unpicking how that might be and what that might enable us to do within a project if kind of other people, what's gone before. So that's a particular thing that I've been looking at within this specific project itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really excited to see what methods we kind of and approaches we end up taking ourselves through this process.
Absolutely.
What we are going to do is we are going to move the conversation shortly. So after 7 o'clock, we are going to move this conversation on to our Discord server, which people can find the link of on our website and through our social media. And you can continue to ask questions to Sarah and Hafsah, because I'm pretty sure I've definitely missed out some, or I've not got through all of them in enough time, which maybe is a good sign. It means we had plenty to talk about. But it would be one thing that I wanted to just finish off on, which I thought was a nice kind of personal question for you both, is, if I can find it now, during this current time, kind of what have you been doing yourselves to keep creatively active and socially engaged?
I've been reading the twits with my daughter, so storytelling and kind of drawing, and from a personal level, that's what kind of the creativity. But from a professional level, I've been working with various organisations at kind of looking at alternative offers for socially engaged opportunities that we can take within the criminal justice setting. Again, with the barriers and limitations that are in place. So that's been quite exciting, because it's enabled to kind of use my imagination really and think about new approaches. So a bit of kind of personal and professional kind of input there.
A healthy mix. What about you, Hafsah?
Well, I've just been spending far too much time on Twitter, for one. And other than that, I've been writing a lot. I think the lockdown and writing just go together, like, I don't know, hand in glove. Like, yeah, I've been writing a lot. And what else? I've become an NHS responder, so I'm hopefully going to be, getting some calls and helping people around my area with shopping and chats and various things. And yeah, I'm quite excited about that. So yeah, lots of new. I've been gardening as well. Just a spot of gardening as well. Yeah.
Nothing wrong with a bit of gardening. The rain has finally arrived to keep our gardens happy.
Absolutely.
As well. Not us, but our gardens will be happy. Thank you both so much for coming on and agreeing to speak to us on our second attempt of our Open Reads programme. And as I said, everyone can join us now on Discord. We'll be there for another half an hour or so, and probably pick up on some more of these questions around kind of photography and this communication tool. And I know some people were interested to talk specifically more about how they think this project might enrich that relationship or process of communication, maybe between the learners in the prison setting and the family members that we're going to work with together. So that might be a question to take on to Discord next.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that is us. We are 7 o'clock on the dot. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you all on Discord for more questions, more chat.
See you there.
Thank you.
Bye.